Hello everyone and welcome to this video. This is a new series all about your grade 6 to grade 8 portfolio. This is for the London College of Music speech and drama syllabus. However, these are my own guidelines. This is what I teach my pupils. If you are my pupil, this is what I want you to do. But talk to your own teacher. If I'm not teaching you and you're here because distance learning is a thing and you need some extra advice, talk to your own teacher because they might have their own ideas about this. So today we are going to talk about choosing your author, researching your author, and then choosing your texts. At grade 6 to 8, you do have a fair amount of freedom. You just have to make sure that whatever author you pick has enough substance to make your folder viable. You might want to pick an author that links to something else that you're doing. So you might want to pick an author that links to a text you're doing for speech and drama for your exam, or you might want to pick an author that links to some stuff that you're doing in school. It's totally up to you. The most important things to consider, first off, is the date. For each grade it's different. For grade 6 it has to be somebody post 1956. For grade 7 it has to be someone pre 1900, and for grade 8 it's somebody between 1580 and 1660 that I want you to use. There are other options in the syllabus. Personally, I find these the most beneficial guidelines in terms of their schoolwork and also the easiest to do, which we all need easy right now. You're also then going to want to think about the types of texts that they wrote. So novels, short stories, plays, poetry, etc. That might inform your choice, depending on what your personal preferences are. Be warned though, at grade 8, if you're doing between 1580 and 1660, it's going to be poetry or plays because the novel didn't exist until the 19th century. So don't be looking for novelists from that period. They don't exist. The third thing you're going to want to think about is the number of texts that they wrote. In my mind, you're going to need at least 3 different texts from that author, potentially 4, but 3 is a good basis. For example, the Brontes are great. I love the Brontes. Wuthering Heights is one of my favourite books, but they'd be really difficult to do a folder on because Emily only wrote Wuthering Heights. Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre, which is great, but then she also wrote a couple of very long, kind of less impressive books after that. So you need to pick an author that has some scope. You need to pick an author that has at least 3 good texts. You might find authors who have 3 books written or 3 plays written, but only one of them's actually good. So do your research, do your homework, and you will thank yourself later when you're not trying to trudge through a really awful book. The fourth thing you might want to think about is something that links to your schoolwork. If, for example, you know that in your school they teach Brian Friel translations at A level, you might want to use him for your grade 6 folder. If you did Steinbeck for GCSE, if you did Of Mice and Men, you might want to use him for a folder. If you've already studied Romeo and Juliet in junior school and Macbeth at GCSE, Shakespeare is the obvious choice at grade 8. There are other Renaissance writers, but he would be a good one if you've already read 2 of his plays. I have created this author suggestions document and I will link it in the description of this video so you can access it. But basically this is just ideas. For these ones, I've included their genre that they wrote in and what type of thing they wrote. Like, did they write children's literature or novels or poetry or whatever? And then I've also included just sort of their best known works. As I've said at the top here, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a good starting point. If you have totally no idea what to do, this is a good place to start. So once you have chosen your author, you're going to want to do a little bit of research on them. It's always a good idea to have a little bit of background knowledge on your author before you read any of their texts. You don't need to know everything about them, but a general idea will really help you when you're looking at different themes and when you come to read the texts. So I've attached another handout in the description, which is this one, and this is literally the most basic information ever, but it will help. So there's a space for the author's name, location, got a whole line because it could have different things to it, so you need to think about where they were born, but also if they moved somewhere throughout their life, like if they moved to a different country, if they moved to a different even a different city within that country, if they lived in the suburbs at the beginning of their life and they moved into the city, that can really affect their writing. Date of birth and death, This will come in more with grade 7 and grade 8 folders, because obviously a lot of the grade 6 people who have been writing post 1956 are probably still alive. So that one's kind of different. And then this is years active. So this is the date their first text was published to the date their last text was published. This is the really important one. Their date of birth and death is interesting to know, but it's not as important as their years active. So the reason for that is, for grade 7, for example, you have to write about an author who was pre-1900. Now, say he died in 1910, but he stopped writing books in 1895. There you go. That is an author who's pre-1900, even though his dates technically don't fall within the period. Does that make sense? So years active is really the bit you're going to want to concern yourself with. Date of birth and death is interesting to know, but this is the really important bit. I've left then space for just your most famous texts from that specific author. Have a look on Goodreads even at their page. Have a look just on Google, see what books come up. And if any of the titles you know immediately, put them down. And then you'll also be able to find easily the texts that were there, most important. Not everyone will have 6 texts. 6 is probably as many as you want to have to look at. You're not going to look at 6 in your folder, but having 6 options to pick from will help when you come to actually picking your texts. And then finally down here, I've left space for any other interesting facts. So like Oscar Wilde, for example, his sexuality is very important to his writing, so that would have to come in here. There's all sorts of things that you could put in here, interesting things about their life. Have a look on places like Sparknotes or eNotes. I don't recommend Wikipedia. I know that this is extra stuff, it's not schoolwork, but Wikipedia is not reliable. So stay away from it. I don't recommend Sparknotes or eNotes if you're studying a book in school, but for this, to get a sort of foundation for your folder, they are really helpful. So Sparknotes, eNotes, I will link them in the description as well, just so that you have easy access. So once you have picked your author and researched your author, you're going to have to choose your texts. So for some folders, this is going to be really easy. So like Suzanne Collins, for example, you're obviously going to pick the Hunger Games trilogy. For others, it's going to take a little bit more work. Collaborate with your teacher on this. As a teacher, I have not read every single book under the sun, but I have a fairly good idea of what books are going to be easy to write on and what books are going to be more difficult. So collaborate with your teacher. So for my pupils, you're going to want to track something through your texts. So all your extracts are going to be vaguely linked. Not all the same necessarily, but vaguely linked. So you can track a character, a relationship, or a theme. So the 3 big themes are gender, race, and class. So you can pick whichever one of those jumps out at you the most. Again, collaborate with your teacher. You will be the expert by the time this is done, but they will have the knowledge at the beginning. So collaborate with them. For example, if you were going to do Lois Lowry, you might look at the dystopian novel and how this has informed more modern works, or you could look at her she's one of the first young adult writers. You could look at how that's informed modern texts. If you were doing J.K. Rowling, you could track a character. You could track Hermione or Snape through the story and see how they develop. If you're looking at Oscar Wilde, you could look at how class and society are represented in his works. There's all sorts of different things you can track, but it just makes your life so much easier if you know before you start reading what you're looking for, what extracts you need. Shakespeare at grade 8 is slightly different. For Shakespeare, you're going to want one of each. So my recommendation would be 1 comedy, 1 tragedy, 1 history, all of those are plays, and then a couple of sonnets, preferably sonnets with different moods or different themes, and that would be your folder. At grade 6 and grade 7, I'd recommend 3 different texts, potentially 4, if they were writing short stories and poetry. So for example, Oscar Wilde, will use him again. He wrote plays, but he also wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a novel, and he also wrote poems. So you might want to do 3 of his plays and a poem, or alternatively, people like Shakespeare, you want to do, it's the same form as grade 8, so 3 of his plays and a sonnet or 2. 4 would be the absolute maximum I would put in your folder. Instead, I would spend the time on your annotations and on your essay at the end, rather than spending a whole lot of time doing lots of different extracts. It's the meat that we need. It's the annotation and the writing. That's the really important bit. Again, your teacher will be able to guide you. For this, I would stick to the canon. Don't try to be fancy. Don't try to pick really obscure things, because that could hinder your discussion in the exam as well. If you have an author that the examiner knows about, you automatically have things to talk about in the exam. You can talk about your feelings, her feelings, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you pick someone who's quite obscure, you're going to be kind of talking at her, which doesn't necessarily go down as well. So that is it for today. We have talked about how to pick your author, research your author, and then how to pick your texts within that author's works. So next week we're going to talk about annotation and why that's important and how to do it and all of that. If you have any questions on any of the author suggestions or on this template or anything, please let me know and I will help you out. Hopefully this is enough to get you started though. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week with our annotation episode.